they were ready for the moment and they took advantage of the moment. And I think that disruption that happened with the pandemic created an opening for them, and they were prepared and ready to take advantage of it. That's when I
Yeah, I
see
think that
what I mean.
I'd slightly disagree that's opportunistic. I think
Okay.
that's planned preparedness in a sense that they're set up, like I said, investing ahead of the curve for when the moment is right. Welcome to the Insurgent Mindset podcast, episode 2. I'm Matt Tice.
I'm Rondo Moses.
And we're going to talk to you today about some case studies to illustrate the insurgent incumbent divide and how some organizations have really gone in different directions over a period of time, and just bring to the forefront some of the leadership challenges that these organizations are facing, some of the opportunities that have been lost or gained, and really just bring this concept to life for you. What do you think, Rondo? So what are our cases today that we're going to sort of explore?
Well, I thought we'd talk about the technology space. And in terms of an incumbent, I thought it would be great to talk about Intel. Intel has been in the news a lot lately. It's having some manufacturing delay challenges. It's been sort of overtaken by a couple of key players in its sector. And so I think it would be a good case study to talk about an organization that has sort of moved into incumbency and has been in that space for a minute now.
Right. And so how are we going to contrast that, Rondo? So if Intel is going to be our archetypical incumbent, what are we going to do to bring some sort of contrast to that case?
Well, I think the goal would be to share some light on the insurgents through Nvidia.
Okay.
Nvidia has also been in the news a lot lately, but for different reasons, because it's been breaking stock market records and record revenue. So I think that would be a good contrast.
Okay, now these are household names by now, Rondo. These are companies that we're all familiar with. Obviously, Intel, the powerhouse of the digital age, from really driving the CPU revolution, particularly with in the PC architecture, and for a while in Macintosh, and obviously as well in the server environment for really the last 45, 50 years. So Intel's been a powerhouse. And of course, then looking at Nvidia, which is the company that really built the industry for graphic processing units, GPUs, and primarily focused on video gaming and high-end graphic applications. But that company's really evolved as well into first the parallel processing kind of area with their CUDA technology, and then sort of flowing then now on into the world's AI powerhouse.
Right, the world's AI powerhouse. But I'd like to, step back with Intel, because I think it's an interesting story. When I think back to when Andy Grove, as you pointed out, when Andy Grove was the CEO, when he joined them in, I guess it was 87, and moved, and Intel was suffering then because it was heavily in the DRAM memory space. And he came in and was the one that really shifted them from that into the microprocessor space, the x86 architecture space. And that's what really gave them legs for almost 2 decades. But, like with many, incumbent organizations, they grew very quickly. They dominated that microprocessor space, but then they lost and took their eye off of opportunities outside of sort of their core market, and got disrupted then. Their first opportunity to be disrupted.
Right. So it can happen. These cycles sort of repeat sometimes.
Right.
Of course, Andy Grove is gone now, and we're in a different age, and far more competitive and certainly more nuanced stage in this particular area.
Yeah, but I think it shows, how organizations, can be so comfortable in their core market, especially when they're dominating in that space, that they don't think about the new technology that's coming next, and whether they're positioned to sort of move to that next curve, so to speak, or that next wave of technology. They just sort of continue to try to exploit as much as they can from the current market that they're in. Because because Intel had a couple of those instances where they lost sight, of where the new opportunity was really coming from. From mobile computing to mobile phones, the smartphones, they were late to get to the smartphones, which allowed AMD an opportunity to, sort of surge past them in terms of the CPU market, because they captured that, smartphone business. And then they lost the opportunity that they had with Apple, because now Apple started making their own chip for their iPhone. So there's a couple
And
of
that's on a totally different architecture than the Intel architecture, which is the Apple favors, and others are now making the shift to the RISC architecture, which has kind of ebbed and flowed over the last couple of decades, but seems to be dominant and ascendant now,
right.
particularly for mobile devices, but also it's the core.
But I think the thing here is that they were the dominant player in chips, and they were partnering with Apple at one point, and they let Apple move away from that partnership because they weren't doing enough to continue to innovate, I guess, for Apple. And then they lost sight of the fact that, Nvidia was making strides in the AI space. So they were too late to recognize the shift to, using GPUs for artificial intelligence. I think that's also was another loss for them.
So I think we could characterize that as a challenge of really sensing the market and understanding kind of where it's all heading. Intel with a strong core business historically anyway in the CPU market and the traditional Intel architecture, and that's been a strong driver for their performance for a really long time. And I think as the market started to shift, Intel really took their eye off the ball, to your point, didn't pay attention in mobile, wasn't competing in, at the time when Nvidia was sort of starting to really invest in these areas, wasn't competing in these sort of fringe GPU, fringe parts of the ecosystem. And, by concentrating so dogmatically on the core business, they lost sight of the change in the market. And then fundamentally, by the time these new technologies reach scale, particularly mobile, but now obviously AI is going at a rate of knots, Intel's really behind the curve on R&D and certainly in their ability to manufacture these chips at scale. And meanwhile, we haven't really talked about TSC and the lock on the foundry business in Taiwan.
Right.
That's a key factor as well, where Intel's kind of really lost their advantage in the foundry space as well. So that's a bit of a challenge. While it's still an R&D powerhouse, at some level, they're investing in the wrong technology, or at least not diversifying that investment into other areas where the market is heading. And meanwhile, they've kind of lost the plot on innovation in new tech, and they've lost the plot on the foundry side as well. It's a real challenge for Intel.
Well, they lost the plot on innovation, but they also lost it on manufacturing. A large part of why they sort of fell behind over the past decade or so is because of manufacturing delays. And that allowed, for example, AMD, which was behind them, to get ahead in the CPU space. And in addition, I think, the idea that there are companies that are looking to be fabless right now. If anything, Intel should be thinking about how does it really focus more on design and outsource more of their chip processing to other companies, like TSMC as well. They should be doing that and really sort of focusing on what I would say their real distinctive capability is in the design space to get them back where they need to be.
Okay, so we characterized Intel as a bit of the classic incumbent, not very close to the market, not scanning opportunities in the market, allowing themselves to be disrupted in two key areas, in manufacturing, foundry, and potentially in R&D. So that's a real downside for Intel. And then meanwhile, Intel's balance sheet is under a lot of pressure to be able to. They don't have the degrees of freedom they might have had a decade ago to be able to make the pivot investments that are required to catch up, or even acquire their way into these spaces. So it's a bit of a pickle for Intel, and certainly they're being punished for it in the markets. Obviously, they're far underperforming AMD and certainly Nvidia, which is at various points in time at least lately, one of the most valuable companies in the world. So
Yeah.
let's switch gears and talk a little bit about Nvidia for a minute, and then let's come back and draw out the lessons in terms of this incumbent, like we described at the beginning, the incumbent insurgent divide. So Nvidia, Rondo, what's the story? Give us the quick explainer on Nvidia.
So from Nvidia, when I sort of watched what's happening with Nvidia, here was a company that had already been in the sort of the GPU space, but as you mentioned, more in the gaming market, and saw an opportunity to move into data centers with GPUs because of all the effective parallel processing, et cetera. They saw it as an opportunity to move into that space, and they did. And they also were able to leverage GPUs for AI, which are much faster processing than CPUs. And that was an opportunity for them to leapfrog others, like Intel and AMD and others who were trying to get into the space because they had a much faster processing chip, which allowed them to lock up the market. I mean, when you look at it now, I think they have 70 to 80% of the AI chip market, which is significant, which gives them a great lead. And I think it's because they were looking for new market opportunities outside of their more traditional gaming market. They were more agile in terms of looking for partnerships and looking for companies to partner with than maybe Intel and some of the others were. And I think for that reason, they're being rewarded for it because no one is able to catch up with them yet. There are some smaller players, I understand, that are starting to make inroads, but right now they are by far the dominant player in the GPU space and in the AI space.
Right. And I think that, in contrast to Intel, which, feels a bit like a monolithic pillar, right? NVIDIA, obviously is much more open. If I can use the analogy, the architecture for the firm is much more open in terms of how they engage with that ecosystem, certainly. But the thing that I find really interesting about NVIDIA is their willingness to invest lots of money, lots of capital ahead of the technology curve, right? So, NVIDIA easily could have fallen into the incumbent trap, if you will, of, we're a graphics processing unit business, we're a GPU business, and we're happy in that space, we're going to dominate that space. But I think NVIDIA has always been open for, new use cases and applications for that technology, and then has put a lot of resources, including outside investment, into those areas to invest ahead of the curve, so that when the market matures, they're ready, they're on top of it. And whereas I think Intel has been much more about protect and defend the CPU market, what I mean? Create the fortress Intel, and largely Intel's kind of been almost the old economy, new economy company, if I can use that sort of that analogy, right? So Intel just has not been able to do that. And like I said a minute ago, they painted themselves into the corner. So, but here's the other thing I'm excited about with NVIDIA is that problem with design and the foundry or the manufacturing side is almost moot for NVIDIA, because the shift that NVIDIA has made, and I think probably the most powerful thing that they've done, is created a software layer for their technology that allows them to lock in their ecosystem to their platform. It's similar to the way Apple created their ecosystem. You almost can imagine once you're on NVIDIA technology, and now something like 15 or 20% of their revenue is coming from software. Once you're on that platform, it's almost impossible to get off. And I think their vision really is to create a more diversified sort of, not just technology company, but also a solutions business that allows them to monetize that, that software. So if you think about, it's similar to what Tesla's done with the electric vehicle, where it's really as much about the software as it is about the hardware. This sort of model, this business model, has allowed NVIDIA to create some flexibility and to create, ARR, annual recurring revenue, into their model in a way that, other chip makers really aren't doing that. So I think it's
well, the NVIDIA, my understanding is the NVIDIA hardware is being used in the Tesla vehicles. So
Indeed, that's one of the key growth areas, and obviously the high needs of self-driving vehicles are very
right,
processor intensive, certainly both in the server area and at end use.
right.
So that certainly has been a driver for some of this technology as well. So again, it just comes back to what's changing in the market, NVIDIA being right on top of that, and then creating these partnerships like with Tesla and others to sort of nurture those
I think
investments.
it speaks to what you were saying around use cases. I think that NVIDIA has just been a lot more creative around moving out of, gaming into, okay, where are the other use case? Data centers, right? So we can do data centers. And now it's autonomous vehicles, it's 5G. So they're always looking for new use cases for what is their capability. This is the GPUs, their distinctive capability, but thinking about the different use cases for it and not getting too attached to one. I think Intel's challenge was they were so tied to the personal computer space that they couldn't look beyond that because one, they were doing so well, but they couldn't look beyond the newer technology that was coming out, newer potential use cases for their CPUs and move into those areas quickly enough.
And of course, that's made them super vulnerable as these changes have sort of kind of unfolded, right? So I think fundamentally, if we zoom back one more time and just sort of describe the meta characteristics of these businesses, right? Because I think, Intel and Nvidia, let's be frank here, Nvidia is not a startup. This is a business that's been for decades, right? So this is an established business that has a completely different mindset, and we would characterize that as the insurgent mindset, where highly dynamic, really responsive to the market, able to create different revenue streams to meet different use cases, really strong in terms of investing ahead of the curve on evolving and emerging technology, able to define and create a space, and moving really at a rate of knots. It's it's a totally different. You can imagine walking the halls of Intel versus walking the halls of NVIDIA. You'd see a completely different culture where that
Right.
mindset is completely different. You'd see one of protect and defend, of protect, defend, extend, which would be characteristic of the Intel model. And then you sort of imagine walking the halls of NVIDIA, which is really about, discover, dominate, iterate, which is kind of a completely different sort of philosophy, I think. And I think the interesting thing to unpick here is the degree to which these are deliberate choices that these two firms have made, right? So Intel, you can imagine them in their castle, digging a deeper moat around, to your point, around the PC and traditional server architecture. And NVIDIA, like the Vikings out on campaign, trying to conquer new lands. It's just a completely different sort of approach.
But I think it gets back to your earlier point about the mindset of, at Intel was all about protecting the core business. So that sort of laser focus on protecting the core business didn't give them enough mind share or room to look at, innovation in new areas and innovation in new markets and sectors because they were so focused on protecting the core business. And I think NVIDIA, as you mentioned, was just much more nimble and thinking about, they could see the writing on the wall from the gaming business and said, hey, we need to find other places where we can leverage this technology that's untapped and provide greater value to what's being provided there now. And that's what I think what they were able to do better than what Intel did. And I think that's important. I think companies, have to start to think that way. Where, you have to understand where are you in your maturity curve and where are the potential risks of new technologies or new business models that might be entering your space that threaten maybe your core business, and figure out ways to reinvent yourself in some way, shape, or form. Whether that is leveraging your current capabilities or developing new capabilities to move you into a different
Sure, I
space.
think that's half of it, right? So every business is going to experience maturity. And I think the question fundamentally is the maturity of the mindset as much as it is the maturity of the market. So Intel, as if we dial the clock back 15 years, is a relatively or extremely rich, well-resourced, very strong technical capability firm, right? So this is a firm that has many of the, classic incumbent advantages, and there's really no good reason why, for example, if, obviously looking in hindsight, there's no good reason why Intel couldn't have taken Nvidia off the board when it, when their resource profile was a little bit more asymmetric in favor of Intel. Now it's the other way around where, who knows? I don't know if anyone wants Intel, but there are still some valuable assets there. But ultimately, I think Intel is just not open to that. So from my point of view, the mindset is as much as anything is the shift where, Nvidia is just much more dynamic than a company like Intel. It's sort of like Intel's almost the Boeing of microprocessors, and Nvidia looks more like a Tesla or an Apple, or more just a much more Silicon Valley dominant kind of mindset. Now, the interesting thing though about Nvidia is difficult because we're still in the era of the founder for Nvidia, right? So the founder has transcended this period of early growth and has proven to be an adept leader to grow the business and help the business adapt and evolve. So we haven't yet seen that second generation challenge with regard to the shift, like we saw it with Microsoft when Bill Gates handed the business over, and Steve Ballmer ran it like an incumbent, like an Intel in this sort of model. And it was only a decade later when Nadella took over Microsoft where that really sort of renaissance took shape. So we'll see, but I think a big test for the leadership at NVIDIA will be, in a generational shift, are they able to maintain that culture, that dynamic quality, and that sort of open sort of view of the ecosystem?
Well, one tell I think regarding the leaders, Jensen Huang's mindset is there's a quote that's attributed to him that he says he's worried and concerned about his company losing its edge. And he talked about that because there are a lot of new players on the rise. And he said, I don't think people are trying to put me out of business. I probably know they're trying to, so that's different. So he has a mindset to me like Andy Grove had, that always you got to be paranoid.
They're on our heels, and we've got to run just a little bit faster.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
And I think as an incumbent, as an insurgent, that's the kind of mindset that you need, because the minute you get complacent, you get too confident is when you sort of miss opportunities in the market. You miss competitors coming at you in the market.
Mm. Now, there's really no evidence that NVIDIA is opportunistic, really, though. They're very buttoned down in terms of their deliberate and intentional approach to, to dominate the AI market, to apply their technology into emerging use cases and so forth. So it's definitely, you can look behind the curtain and see that there's a strong strategic, mentality in terms of how that business evolves. So there's no doubt in my mind that there's strong intentionality to what they're doing, but their ability to respond to change in the market is fascinating. In particular, one thing that I think is really interesting is how they've driven down the cycle time of their new development, for example, to your point, to stay relevant and to keep on top of that change, which has made a big difference. Their ability to bring their community in through the software to learn from how people are using their technology in the field, and then take that and use that as feedback to make adjustments, where I feel Intel is much more engineering led in a sense where, they're inside out in their projection of their technology. They build, you take, and that's, I think, quite different perhaps than what NVIDIA does. So we describe that as customer proximity, but you can see that difference is really quite strong in these two cases, where NVIDIA is obviously much closer to how the needs of these customers are evolving, and particularly with AI, where almost in real time this new industry is inventing itself and evolving and kind of hasn't really reached any equilibrium yet. NVIDIA is right at the heart of that, working with developers and working with end users and really trying to understand how this is all going to evolve. Where in the PC market, that's really quite mature, and there aren't really that many questions that aren't that haven't been answered. It's just a question of, better energy efficiency, smaller chips, and lower cost per unit, right? So ultimately, that's why that space in the CPU area is commoditized, and we're just not seeing that dynamism.
But I think that NVIDIA was opportunistic because during the pandemic, we saw the demand for AI surge, because of the demand for more remote work, et cetera. I think that they were ready for the moment and they took advantage of the moment. And I think that disruption that happened with the pandemic created an opening for them, and they were prepared and ready to take advantage of it. That's when
I think that I'd slightly disagree that's opportunistic. I think that's planned preparedness, in a sense that they're set up, like I said, investing ahead of the curve for when the moment is right.
Right.
They're ready, and sure, COVID played a role in that, but really, I think as AI has really broken out, has been slightly post-COVID in terms of mass adoption of AI, at least in, I'm not saying it's been around for decades, but
right.
Certainly in the public mindset, AI is now mainstream. So, but anyway, coming back to it, I feel like NVIDIA has programmed this ready for what's next, and really driving what's next into that culture, into that into their approach, and then therefore they create conditions around NVIDIA as a firm that allows them to capitalize on these opportunities as they start to gather steam. But we'll see. I mean, it's there's
I agree with you. I agree with you. I think, to me, because they were so agile, that was their ability to take prepared and agile. They were able to take care of the opportunity that was presented because of that disruption.
Yeah. But now here we are, looking over the horizon. There's no guarantee that this might be a period of the Andy Grove post Intel, the original period that you talked about. This could be a period that may look like that for NVIDIA as new challengers come onto the scene. So we'll see. Right, at a point in time, we never really can tell. But if we look at the success of these two businesses, it's clear that NVIDIA, a company at scale, one of the world's largest, most valuable companies, most valuable, not necessarily largest. This is a company that could rest back on its laurels and fall into that trap, but clearly hasn't at this stage. But we'll see how that plays out. But ultimately, I think it's interesting because often when we talk about the challenger, people think in their minds that it's all about the startup, the small nimble business. This is not a small business, but it is a nimble business, right? So I think ultimately the most interesting question is, are firms at scale able to program their culture and their leadership to adopt these characteristics of the insurgent to create, really, really disruptive and, ultimately market-beating value? I think NVIDIA is a great case that sort of illustrates that. And Intel, with all of its advantages, at various points has been able to capture some of that value, but they certainly haven't been able to build that persistently into their culture.
Right.
And through these different stages of leadership, the current fellow Pat Gelsinger, who's running Intel now, is probably, I'm guessing that his time will be limited there unless Intel either finds a buyer or a significant investor to help them make a pivot at scale to turn the dial. But is there any territory available to Intel where they can catch up? I'm not convinced.
Well, would you agree that part of maybe the challenge is that these companies like an Intel, because it was under so much pressure because of the manufacturing delays over the years, and so much pressure to maintain their quarterly results, that they were so focused on the short term that they lost sight of the longer term, the innovation, which is in some cases could be a longer term play for them. They lost sight of those things. I asked that because I have a client in this situation now where some of the leadership feels that there's an over focus on the financial results now versus setting up for the long-term sustainability of the organization. And I think that that's what happens to leaders who have more of an incumbent mindset, that they're only thinking about, am I hitting my quarterly or my annual result, and not about what do I need to be successful 3 to 5 years from now.
That's a great question, right? So first, let's be clear that, if you're sitting in Gelsinger's sort of chair, there's a lot of pressure, right? So, the shareholders are demanding dividends and returns, and that's certainly, on his mind. I'm sure the board is going to be also, reflective of that culture, even driving that culture in terms of that conservative approach. And, and then you have 40 or 50 years of sedimentary sort of culture as well through several layers of leadership. So it is quite difficult to make that pivot. But make no mistake, Intel's investing billions of dollars. It's not like they're not making investments. It's just what they're investing in is, perhaps directionally about preserving and extending the core business, whereas Nvidia is investing more on the margin in a sense that, it's really about what's next, and putting in billions of dollars, backing those investments, creating new markets, et cetera, which is completely different than the sort of mindset of Intel. So I agree that, I agree that that's difficult, but I come back to the point that it's a choice that you make. And, that choice fundamentally in Intel's case is led them down on a path of making the wrong investments persistently over too long of a period of time, which has boxed them into this situation, which now looks awfully difficult to dig themselves out of. So, I predict that there will be that someone will take Intel off the table in the next sort of probably within 18 to 24 months. We'll see whether that's Intel led or whether it's led by someone else. We'll see what happens.
I was just looking at a list of all the Dow 30 companies earlier this week. And, of course, Intel's on that list. And I was wondering to myself, how much longer are they going to be there? Given what's going on, I mean, how much longer?
I don't think very long. There's already been talk about Intel being delisted from that group. And of course, it is natural in the economy to have this turnover. But, I think the lesson for Intel is, they have to break the pattern, right?
Yeah.
And breaking that pattern means Intel's got to get much closer to the market. Intel's got to create a new dialogue about what the future of computing is. Intel's got to open up its architecture to be more engaged with different ecosystem partners to discover new applications. Intel needs to be more strategic about acquisitions and I don't know if they have the balance sheet sort of flexibility to do that, but they need to be putting this new capability that you mentioned before into the center of their growth story. And I just don't know if all that complexity is just too much for this leadership. I think it really is going to require a different mindset from investors are going to need to be more patient. Intel probably needs to shake up its board a little bit, probably needs new leadership at the top. Otherwise, Intel's going to be in trouble. But again, I come back to the point over and over again that it's a choice, and Intel is largely painted themselves into this corner, and Nvidia so far hasn't. So I think we can see that, if you could bottle up that sort of culture at Nvidia just one more time, highly market and customer proximate, super dynamic, investing ahead of the curve, looking for consumer use cases that didn't exist in the past, carefully and deliberately making investments to sort of nurture those, creating an open architecture for how they bring capability into the business, working with partners both downstream and upstream, creating a balance in terms of revenue, which I think is really exciting, about the manufacturing, about the software, about the R&D, licensing out technology and capability very prudently to third parties to stimulate demand in the market. It's a clever company, and I think that's been you can see all these elements. If you step back, these are what insurgents do.
Yeah. So if you were the CEO of Intel, Pat Gelsinger, what would be one of the first things you would do to help move the company forward?
Well, I'm glad you added that last part, because if I were Gelsinger, I think my first instinct would be to make sure I've got the golden handcuffs pretty well pretty well negotiated. But you know, I think probably there's 3 or 4 big options for Intel. One is to break up the company and you know, really fundamentally separate development from the foundry. So I think that's a big part of it. Maybe I think that you know, Intel's got to, you know, really a big part of Intel's challenge is financial. So they've got to fix that balance sheet and get you know, restore the business to growth, and that's going to be challenging. So I think to me that speaks to, you know, partnerships that that may not be quite traditional for Intel, and you know, and I think it is actually a legitimate path for Intel to say that we may not be the best steward of this part of the industry anymore, and you know, potentially there is an exit question there, whether or not you know, is another owner better to use the assets of Intel to take this part of the industry forward. I don't know the answer, but these will be really difficult questions for the board and the leadership team at Intel. But you know, ultimately though, in order for Intel to maintain itself as a going concern in the long term, they're going to have to make a radical change from their historic sort of last 20-year kind of default strategy of protect, maintain, and defend. So anyway, Rondo, we're just running out of time. So a terrific discussion, and we'll explore more of these topics in our next podcast, the Insurgent Mindset Series 3, where we'll unpack a few more cases and then get a little bit nuanced into some more of these areas. So for more information, you can come and see us at the Insurgents Group YouTube channel or the Insurgents Group website, which we'll make available at the end of the podcast. Thanks.
And
Ron.
on LinkedIn.
One more time.
And on LinkedIn.
And on LinkedIn. All right. Thanks so much, Rondo. It was great chatting with you, and look forward to seeing you in the next go around for podcast 3.
Thanks, Matt. Look forward to it.
All the best.